So in case you're wondering why we seem to be to suspend the language, it's because we're teaching to our second panelists who we understand is on the field. Well, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Colombo launch of the book by Mark Salter, To End the Civil War, Norway's Peace Engagement in Sri Lanka. On behalf of the three organizations, the Center for Policy Alternatives, the National Peace Council, and the International Center for Ethnic Studies, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you. I assume that most of you, and indeed it may well be the case that at least two of us on the panel may not have been able to read the book from cover to cover because of logistical problems, have not had a chance to go through the book. Some of you may have read of the launch in other parts of the world and even of some reviews and comments with regard to it. I think we are indeed fortunate to have this volume for no other reason that there is very little that has actually been said about the peace process in Sri Lanka. Very little that has been written with regard to it, and most importantly also, very little that has been written which has had access to primary actors, major actors in that whole process, who are the principal contributors as far as this book is concerned, namely Mr. Eric Solheim and Mr. Vida Helderson. So in that sense, it is very much at one level an account of the Norwegian involvement in the Sri Lankan peace process from the perspective of these two major actors. But it is not that alone. I think it is something that can well be considered to be the primary source material for debate in terms of public discourse, as well as rich material for individual research and academic research. I understand that it is not presented as an academic volume per se, but I think by reading it, there is a lot that can be gained from an academic perspective as well. So in that sense, it is seminal. It does make a contribution, whether you agree with its contents or not. It's an important addition, I think, to the story of this country in the last so many decades of challenge and travail, and entirely to be welcomed in that respect. The format for this evening's launch will be that Mr. Mark Salter, the author, will first of all make a presentation in terms of the book, the challenges in writing it, what perspective it's from, what it hopes to achieve, and then I will turn it over to our two distinguished panelists, who I don't need no introduction, but Dr. Jayatilleka on my immediate right, our former ambassador to the Geneva UN Human Rights Council, and Dr. Jehan Perera, the Executive Director of the National Peace Council, two Sri Lankans who have been very much involved in the conflict resolution process, both as actors as well as critics, observers, supporters in a variety of incarnations over the years, and therefore eminently equipped to make comment, observation, and critique of the book. So without much further ado, since we've also talked about it in 10 minutes, let me turn over to Mark and ask him to make his introductory remarks.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah. I will just begin my remarks by also adding a note of fact to the hosts of this meeting, the Central Centre for Ethnic Studies and Directore, but also to Sarah and Jehan for their efforts to help make this event happen. I should add that there is an element of, perhaps we could call it personal interest in the selection of the persons on this panel here. All three were interviewed for the book, all are quoted in the book, all providing important contributions to my understanding and perspective on events in this country. There are also other people in the room whose names I won't necessarily mention who also contributed to the book. So nice to have those contributors here, co-contributors. Okay, I'm going to just make a few remarks about the book, and I'm going to slightly rely on Sarah to tell me when to stop going on. Because of course there's lots to be said, but let me just begin with a few attentions, how this book came about. I was approached in 2012 by my actually former boss for International Idea, Vidar Helgesen, who asked me whether I would be interested in the idea of writing something about the Norwegian role in the conflict here in Sri Lanka. So I was interested in principle. I travelled with Vidar to Oslo for the day to meet Erik Solheim, just to explore what this might look like. I have to confess, at first I had a slight reservation. I was a bit worried that what they were looking for was a sort of glorified ghostwriter, you know, so kind of a hagiographic. The wonderful peace-loving Norwegians coming to, attempting to come to the rescue of organized Sri Lanka. I'm glad to say that that's not what they wanted, not least because if that had been what they wanted, I would have refused to do it. What they wanted instead was an account of what the Norwegians thought they were trying to do in Sri Lanka, and also of how other people, other actors, both on the ground here in Sri Lanka and internationally, viewed their efforts. So it is not, it attempts at least to be as objective as it can in its account. It is an account that is informed, as Sarah mentioned, primarily by a series of interviews I did with a very wide range of people, both here in Sri Lanka, but also in other parts. For example, from the US State Department, those in the US who have been involved in the, especially the co-chairs initiative, from the UN, from the EU, from the SLMM, the Sri Lankan Monitoring Mission, and various other individuals who, one way or another, had been directly involved. So that was my primary source material. Of course, I'm ultimately responsible for the content, but to the greatest degree possible, I've attempted to reflect what other people told me that they thought or saw or observed during the course of the peace process. So that's a little bit about the background of the book. Perhaps maybe just one other thing I'll mention is that why did the Norwegians want to do this? Well, I can't tell you with certainty, but my strong sense is that, you know, especially during the latter stages of the war, in particular after Mahinda Rajapaksa came to power as president at the end of 2005, but also after the war, the Norwegians very sort of slowly but surely descended into this role of sort of whipping boy. You know, so basically anything went wrong, blame it, when in doubt, blame it on the Norwegians. And you know, sort of nicely captured by that memorable phrase of Manga Samaroiris, who described the Norwegians as salmon-eating busybodies. I think that captures very nicely a certain sentiment regarding the Norwegians at that time. Now, I think by and large they took it on the cheek at that stage. They didn't react or respond or attempt to counter criticism or just straight slander, frankly, in many instances. But especially after the war, I think there was a feeling of sadness, of course, as to what had happened in terms of the huge loss of life in the end of the war, coupled with a feeling of perhaps that they had a story that deserved to be told, a perspective, not the unique truth, but a perspective on the war that perhaps hadn't been sufficiently heard or told. And that's maybe why they asked for it. Now, I'm going to just mention a couple of things here, because that's all I've got time for, really, more than taking the questions later. The first thing I want to touch on is the whole thing of how on earth the Norwegians got into this business of peace facilitation in Sri Lanka in the first place. It's quite a long and quite a detailed story. The first chapter of the book sort of lays it out, at least as I understand it. But I mean, to just cover a few highlights. I mean, the first Norwegian engagement in this country comes in the mid-late 60s in the form of some modest development projects. At this point, Sri Lanka was not a priority country for Norway in terms of development assistance. But there were projects, and they were in the south. Into the 70s, things tempo ups a bit. Sri Lanka establishes an embassy for the Nordic countries in Stockholm in 1973, which of course facilitates contacts. And into the 80s, we have a situation where, following the start of the war, the Norwegians become much more explicit that their development assistance should, in material ways, be linked to efforts to attenuate, to resolve, to counteract the conflict. Things that really sort of pick up into the 90s. The first, to my awareness, invitation to the Norwegians to kind of get involved in some more formal sense in mediation efforts actually comes in 1990. And it came through a Norwegian by the name of Pathioksoy, who still lives here, who was friendly with the then government here, and he was used as a kind of conduit to the Norwegians. Through the 90s, things developed, and there's an interesting quotation from Jan Egeland, who was Norwegian State Secretary during about 92 to 97. He's talking about the period from about the mid-90s, so this is after the so-called Oslo process in the Middle East, which is probably the most spectacular, the best known facilitation effort the Norwegians have been involved in. And he mentions that there were confidential meetings in Geneva, which the Norwegians facilitated between the two sides, and that there was plans for some follow-up. But when Hamid, the Justice Minister, who was on the Pathioksoy's contact, went out of power, things halted. Then when Chandrika Kumaratunga is elected towards the end of 1994 and initiates her own peace initiative, starting with exchanges of letters with Perera and with a ceasefire proposal, the Norwegians are pulled in at that point. And again, this is one of the sort of lesser-known forms of the peace process. At least I think it's the lesser-known form, which I touch in the book. There was signed in, I think it was towards the end of 1995, a declaration for the cessation of hostilities between the two sides. So 5th January 1995. And part of the provisions of that declaration was to set up a team of international monitors of a ceasefire. And 3 countries and 1 organisation were invited to take part in that. And one of those countries was Norway. So, I mean, you can see that already there you have a sort of substantive Norwegian engagement. The other countries were Canada and the Netherlands, and then the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, it never went anywhere else, not least because the ceasefire unravelled in April, I think it was, 1995. So there was obviously not much point in having monitoring. But an interesting aspect of this event is that if you actually read the text of the Declaration of the Cessation of Hostilities, if you do it today, one of the things that may strike you, it says something, is the close similarity between provisions in that agreement and the CFA, the ceasefire agreement of February 2002. Now, I think there's more research to be done there, because I don't think anybody's really examined more carefully why it is, or how it was, that there was that transference of knowledge or perspective on how to frame an agreement. But possibly the presence of Norwegians in both instances may have had something to do with it. Okay, again, just for time. The Norwegians established an embassy here in 1996, and obviously that makes things a lot easier in terms of direct bilateral contacts. But I think the thing that really, really is the game changer here is what is known in the book, because that's what the Norwegians described it as, the kidney saga. What do I mean by that? I mean that by 1998 it was apparent that Anton Balsing, the chief, who was to become, and had been previously, the chief negotiator from the LTT side, was seriously ill. He had a very serious kidney problem, which would require a transplant. The LTT approached the Norwegians in Oslo and basically said to them, look, we need to get Balsing out of the country and we need him to have a transplant. Would you be prepared to help out? Now again, I can't go into the full story here, but after a long deliberation, the Norwegians said, well, okay. And despite the fact that ultimately the government of Sri Lanka refused to allow Balasingham to depart the country and live under an officially sanctioned regime, he nonetheless did, I think probably with the government's tacit agreement, was taken by ship to Thailand, by the Sea Tigers, and eventually made his way to Oslo, where he did indeed have a kidney transplant, and from there then eventually moved to London. He was a British citizen and went on to play the key role in the peace process that we know that he played. Now I mention this event because I think it was a game changer, and it was a game changer for both sides of the conflict here. I think for the government, my distinct impression from having talked to Jayatilleka about this was that the feeling was that the Norwegians had conducted themselves with appropriate discretion, had built confidence on both sides, and also delivered something that ultimately everybody agreed was desirable. From the LTT's perspective, it was perhaps even more substantial. The kidney saga proved that the Norwegians could deliver. And I think that is the context in which, at the end of 1999, Jayatilleka does something that still to many Norwegians is seen as quite extraordinary, which is that having narrowly survived an assassination attempt in her life, an LTT bomber during the election campaign, announces from a hospital bed in a BBC interview in December 1999 that Norwegians are now henceforth the official facilitators of an attempted peace process with the LTT. Now, for the Norwegians, this was extraordinary because they had no idea she was going to say this. And I think they kind of came round to it eventually after they sort of picked themselves up off the floor. Remember, everything that had happened up till then, in terms of the Norwegian role, had been done in the strictest confidence, with an absolute demand from the government side that that be returned in which it's done. And to then have the president suddenly sort of, gaily in a BBC interview announce this back to the world was perhaps a little surprising. However, everybody kind of managed it, and from there, obviously, the official efforts to move towards negotiations really took off. But I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. I'm just going to note in passing that if one thinks about what the Norwegians were doing, I think one needs to think about the whole concept of peace facilitation in the post-Cold War world. And the key point here is that I think, in my judgment, after the Cold War, the Norwegians, perhaps first and foremost amongst smaller states, spotted a kind of strategic window of opportunity. That conflicts which hitherto had been totally hostage to the Cold War, that warring parties were clients of one of the major powers. But now things were loosening up. So already from the early 1990s, I mean literally from 1990 actually, that's the first time we're in Guatemala, Norwegians facilitating some of the early dialogues between the government and the guerrilla. And then through the Middle East peace process, the Oslo process, we can see the Norwegians really moving in this direction. And just a quote for you from Jan Egeland, the State Secretary that I mentioned earlier. He's talking now about the mid to late 1990s. So this gives you a feeling of what was going on in Oslo. He says, one way, this is what he said to me, one way or the other, I must have been part of about 10 peace processes. The Oslo Agreement, meaning the Middle East, was the most spectacular, of course. It surpassed anything that Norwegian diplomats had achieved previously. At that time, frankly, things became crazy. At least once a week, I must have had parties to a conflict, or facilitators, or the media, coming to me and saying, can you take this peace process as well, please? This was wrong, of course. It was too much, and it led us into processes that ultimately led nowhere, such as Sri Lanka. I'll just finish on that point by saying that it was very clear to me from talking to Jayatilleka that the factor of Norway's track record in peace facilitation in particular the Oslo process for the Middle East, which at that point was still my ultimate succeed, did play something of a role in the eventual decision of the government of Sri Lanka to ask the Norwegians to play the facilitating role. They, to some extent, they proved their credentials. And of course, they weren't the only candidates. I mean, Jayatilleka had looked at a number of other countries. Some of you will know the details of this. France, for example, for reasons that have their own dynamic in terms of the former president's own background, perhaps. But, you know, the Norwegians were the ultimate choice. And I think, finally here, the Norwegians ended up, it's like they came to see that peace facilitation was a kind of positive branding for the country. You know, this was something that you could sell abroad. And that they did this, and very successfully. And behind it, of course, was a bipartisan support for this. The two sides of the political spectrum in Norway ended up lining up in support of peace facilitation in general, and the facilitation effort in Sri Lanka in particular. And that was an important sort of basis for it. Okay, how's the time? Another 5, all right. I'm going to just talk about 2 things here. The first is one of them we might do, and this is the kind of thing that I get into in the book in the final chapter, which is a long chapter on lessons learned. So now I'm just going to talk about some of the lessons learned from Sri Lanka. Number 1 is the Norwegians made a critical mistake at an early stage in the peace process, which is that they failed to sufficiently appreciate the importance of bipartisan political support for the peace process within the majority singular policy in this country. I mean, for reasons that are kind of understandable, you know, a new government comes into power in 2001. Ranil Wickremesinghe's last time round, you know, promising and talking peace. It's not difficult to understand why the Norwegians, and to be fair to them, they weren't alone in this. Many others said, right, let's run with this. These are the people who are going to take things forward. Not that nagging president who keeps sniping at them from the side and so on. Well, okay, but, you know, let's not forget that only 2 years previously, roles had been, shall we say, somewhat reversed. When Jayatilleka was trying to get her so-called devolution package through the Sri Lankan Parliament in summer 2000, it was Ranil Wickremesinghe and his party who were burning copies of the draft constitution and agitating against it on the ground that it was an attack on the country's sovereignty. You know, I think if you'd thought about that, you might have just wondered whether just going with one party was the right way to do things. But anyway, the better product was that's what they did. And of course that is partly what then paved the way for the ultimate break, that is to say, the aftermath of the ISGA, Interim Self-Governing Authority proposal, which the LTT tabled in autumn 2003. Jayatilleka, a few weeks after that, declares a state of emergency with the country's security is at stake. She takes back control of 3 key ministries, including the defence ministry, from the Prime Minister. And, you know, the thing is tottering badly. I think the Norwegians recognised that that was a mistake. That even if it meant that the peace process had gone slower, that probably strategically it would have made more sense to have tried to achieve consensus and agreement with the president in advance of any agreement being signed. Even with all the risks that entailed, the timing, you know, needing to move forward, and LTT impatience, probably that would have been a more sensible thing to do. And I would just leave that point by saying that, you know, I think experience with peace processes around the world, I mean, in my own country, from the UK, if you think about the Northern Ireland process, you know, bipartisan support was essential. Without, in Britain, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party agreeing that peace was the priority, and thus, you know, whichever government was in power, in this case Tony Blair's Labour government, it wouldn't have happened. So I think there is a strong lesson there about peace processes in general, which is the need to take all key stakeholders with you, or at least have them minimally not objecting or kind of weak support of what you do. the risks far outweigh the possible benefits that come with just moving with the strongest parties and those who don't. Okay, one final point, and then I really will stop. And this is something that probably not everyone here is going to like, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's about what I see as the lost the lost opportunities of the peace process. The key moments when things could have moved in a different direction and didn't. And I'm going to highlight three of them, just mentioned. The first is April 2003, when the government announces that, along with the other parties to the peace process, the Norwegians primarily, that a donor conference will be held in Washington to discuss reconstruction efforts. And of course, the official spin was that this was a follow-up to the donor meeting that happened in Oslo 6 months previously, the Tokyo one. It was part of a sequence of donor meetings. So, what's your problem? Well, my friends, what's your problem is that you've chosen to have the meeting in a place where your partners in the peace process, the LTT, are unable to show up because they're a prescribed organisation. So they're not going to be allowed into the country to turn up at the meeting. Duh! Not a great way to do a discussion if what you want is bipartisan support for it. So, and I know there's lots of, you can hear people say, well, the LTT knew about it. They probably did. That still doesn't change the fact that not treating partners to a process as partners, meaning that they get, for the purposes of the peace process, not necessarily broad politics, equal treatment or equality of respect, it's a no-go. Okay? Now, I know a lot of people will resist that argument because they'll say, how can you possibly treat the LTT on the same level as the sovereign legitimate government of Sri Lanka? Well, the point is this: in the peace process, parties are parties. Whether they're from Mars or whether they're from the bottom of the ocean, it doesn't matter. For the purposes of the process, they have to be treated as equal in respect and equally part of the process. That's my view. Second lost window of opportunity was the ISGA, the interim self-governing authority. We know very well that this document, as it was finally tabled, was a kind of maximalist position. We even have clear evidence to suggest that the final version the LTT put on the table was a good deal more radical than the one that they'd been negotiating around in Paris and the governments earlier in the year. But that aside, it is the moment which, as I mentioned earlier, Chandra chooses to declare a state of national emergency, and a lot of people will just say, well, it was a ridiculous document, that how could anybody possibly consider it? Well, with all respect, I have to say, I think it must be understood that this document came fundamentally as the result of a request from the government of Sri Lanka. The government of Sri Lanka had been saying to the LTT all the way through the peace process, come forward with a political proposal, please. Come forward and tell us what it is you want. So, it took them a long time, but that is what the LTT did eventually. And I think it should have been understood better that whatever was in the text, that was the process of which it was the outcome. The second thing is, it was palpably a negotiation document. It was a proposal. So, and I think some people within the government even understood that quite clearly, actually. So it wasn't written in stone. Everything was up for discussion in principle. So why I think it was a strategic mistake at the highest level to not have understood the document in that way and to treat it like that. Third and finally is the tsunami. Why do I say that? Because it seems to me that the LTT response to the tsunami, the political response, was potentially a real breakthrough. Why? Because once the so-called PTOMs, the post-tsunami operational mechanism document, which was the thing that was supposed to set out how assistance for the country as a whole would be, post-tsunami assistance would be dispersed in structures and mechanisms and what have you. The LTT said, yeah, very quickly they accepted this idea in principle. And what was key about that was this was the first time the LTT had ever accepted the notion of working under the authority of the sovereign government of Sri Lanka, and doing it in a framework that would then be an agreement going forward. Obviously, the hope for many people was that PTOMs would have served the same function, ironically, as the tsunami did in Aceh, in Indonesia, which is that it was the tsunami was the thing that got the peace process going. It was what led the Aceh liberation movements to decide to negotiate with the government and led eventually to peace settlement, to the autonomy that the region enjoys today, and if anybody visits there will tell you the extraordinary progress the region has made since then. Instead of which, what happened here? So we know what that LTT initiative was quickly lost in the quicksands of domestic singular politics, nationalist, increasingly vocal critique of the whole notion of PTOMs, and then the thing is finally thrown out in the Supreme Court in the summer. And my final thing, why I mention this particular example, is because the Norwegians made this very clear to me. In their view, the tsunami and the PTOMs failure was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the point at which the LTT said, look, if you can't even, in the context of this disaster, accept what we're trying to do, well, frankly, we've had enough. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the murder of Lankan, the Foreign Minister, comes within 2 months of the Supreme Court throwing out the PTOMs document. In other words, yes, begin the descent back into the vortex of senseless terrorism. So those are lost opportunities. There's not much we can do about them now, but there may be things we can learn. I'll happily take questions on the things I mentioned and other aspects of the book, but thank you for your attention, and let's hear from the others. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for that introduction and for highlighting some of the issues that need to be looked into more deeply. I'm sure that the last part of your presentation will probably inspire a number of questions with regard to bipartisanship, with regard to the tsunami, with regard to the PTOMs question, the ISGA, and all of that. So there are some markers there for questions as we go into a wider discussion. So let me now turn over to Dr. Dayan.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Mark. This is an indispensable book. I read it in 2 cities. It's irresistible. It's really a treasure book, a chronicle of the Norwegian and the larger Western engagement in the attempt at a negotiated settlement to the Sri Lankan conflict. Now, as Mark said, it's a perspective. And it is valuable not only because of what it chronicles, but also because it sheds light on the present and the possible futures of Sri Lanka. So it sheds light not only on the past, but also on the present and the possible futures. My position in responding to the book does not belong to either of the 2 standard views on the Norwegian ethnic. The 2 views are either to laud or damn the Norwegians. And those 2 positions of applause and condemnation correspond broadly to 2 ideological positions. Those who laud the Norwegian effort, warts and all, belong to or adhere to what I would call the neoliberal perspective of peace building. All of this is part of the liberal paradigm of peace building. And those who denounce the Norwegians do so from a neoconservative position. Now mine, as I said, is neither. Mine is a critique of the Norwegian engagement. Neither denunciation nor praise. It's a critique. And it's a critique that is neither neoliberal nor neoconservative, but belongs to what is known in the literature as the realist perspective. Deriving from the realist perspective, I would say that Marx's book is the story of a tragedy. It was a tragedy foretold, least significantly in my own journalistic writing and public interventions at that time, but more importantly by people such as John Hugh, who at the end of a press conference actually said, well, you know, this Norwegian process may as well be shut down because it's not going to work. So, this is a chronicle of a tragedy foretold, but a tragedy that was avoidable. This outcome could have been avoided. And now we come to the lessons learned part of it. I say this not with the benefit of hindsight, because I had been saying this at that time. My critique has a contemporary relevance, because my fear is that the same mistakes, the same flaws are being repeated today, and therefore will lead to the same outcome. Of course, there's no LTTE, but I'm talking about the large outcome of failure. There are those who may say, but look, we have a new government, it's not the nasty Mahinda Rajapaksa. But then again, throughout this book, and most of the book, you did have the same players. Ranil Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister, Chandrika Bandaranaike as President. And now you have the same duo, more or less doing the running, though former President Kumaratunga doesn't have the same weight, politically speaking, of course, that she had at the time. But it's the same pair, the same paradigm, and is likely to lead to exactly the same outcome of failure. Now, my critique is not one of personalities, nor is it to doubt the intentions of the Norwegians. This book proves that there was a very energetic and sincere engagement on the part of many Norwegian players. But the engagement was thoroughly misplaced, not thought through, conceptually careless, and processually shoddy, and therefore doomed to fail. And if that is not understood, this same error will be repeated in other parts of the world and will be repeated here in Sri Lanka in our present post-war or post-conflict situation. Now, what are those conceptual and processual errors? Let me put it as simplest. A detective, we've seen this in movies, several times over. Say 7. You're talking about somebody responsible for multiple murders. What does the new detective on the case do? He looks at the old files. He goes and talks to the guys who worked the case before. Most of them are in fire. He re-interviews those people. That's where he starts from. Now, if you think that I'm being a little facetious, let's talk about a doctor. The doctor would look at the files, look at the test reports, and identify the nature of the tumor. Is it benign or is it malignant? Now, if I may preempt some misgivings on your part, I am not leading up to a conclusion that there should have been a military solution, that war was desirable. I'm saying no. This could have been done better, it might have worked, and if it didn't work, there could have been a plan B, even if war broke out, which was probable, and you could have had a political solution even during or with the end of the war. But because the entire effort was conceptually so ill-founded, none of that happened. And you had what I call the Old Testament outcome that we witnessed. Now, what should have been done instead? By the time the Norwegians entered the picture, much had happened in terms of efforts of peacemaking. When I read the book, I read it with a sense of sadness, because that is the reinvention of the wheel. There seems to be a certain repetitive pattern. The government of the day proposes something, is not seen to be enough, then the tigers is myth, and there's friction which leads to conflict, and there's a sense that perhaps they weren't treated very well or treated as equals or whatever. Now, all of that was easily avoidable if one had only studied the Indian peacemaking efforts. The Indians treated the tigers like no other insurgent movement has been treated. I'm not going into the whole question of whether they were armed or not. There's a very interesting sentence in this book about a guy who was given anti-aircraft missile training, a tiger. Anti-aircraft missile training by the Indians in the 1980s. As you can see, Mark, I read everything in the book. No, I'm not going down that road. What I'm saying is that in 1986, at the Bangalore SAARC summit, where the Prabhakaran was airlifted to Bangalore by Rajiv Gandhi for proximity talks with President Jayatilleka. The tigers were treated very well by the Indians. Those who lived through that, such as myself, remember the first interim administration of September 1987 after the Lanka Accord, in which Venerable Prabhakaran's LDP was given 7 of the 12 seats, including the chairmanship. And they walked out on the deal. So anybody who cared to find out that history, to look at the files, would have known the kind of movement they were dealing with, the nature of the animal, no pun intended. By the time the Norwegians came on board, the tigers had killed Rajiv Gandhi, which is rather like if the Palestinians had killed Yitzhak Rabin, or the IRA had killed Tony Blair, or John Hume, or George Mitchell. They had killed Rajiv Gandhi, Nehru's grandson. They had killed Ranasinghe Premadasa, who engaged in a politically expensive negotiation with them. So, you were dealing with a particular type of movement. So that is a major conceptual flaw in the entire Norwegian exercise. What was that flaw? We know from Aristotle onwards, and that's a very long time ago, that regimes can be classified according to type. What goes for regimes also goes for anti-regime or anti-state movements. Not every armed movement is the same as every other armed movement. There are movements that prove through their political behavior that they are capable of a successful negotiated settlement, and there are movements which are far more intransigent. Once you killed Rajiv Gandhi, you deliberately put yourself beyond the pale. So, the behavior of a movement, just like the behavior of a person, if repeated over time, makes it classifiable as recidivist. This is so if you're dealing with a criminal or a serial killer. Prabhakaran, and this is not a singular perspective on my part, Prabhakaran was named by the Sunday Times magazine, Sunday London, the Times magazine of the millennium. There was a special edition, the thematic edition, the edition on death, named him as the single individual most responsible for the largest number of violent deaths in the world by that time. So when you're dealing with a movement like that, you have to design your process accordingly. Now what could have been done? I repeat, I'm not saying that somebody should have gone and dropped the bomb. what should have been done was to shift the paradigm from the utterly naive and utopian model that the Norwegians were using to another model which has very deep roots indeed in Western thinking. Very deep ethical roots, may I say, in Western thinking. I'm talking about the realist model. And here we go back to even Christian theologians like Niebuhr and Hans Morgenthau, where you adopt a realist position even when you're dealing with, and especially if you're dealing with a totalitarian movement. And there, the strategy should have been, if I may oversimplify, two-pronged: containment and deterrence. Now, this is a well-known doctrine of Western diplomacy when it comes to states, but it is no less true of movements of a certain type, because here you are not dealing with a rational, idealist, romantic Nicaraguan or Salvadoran or Guatemalan type of guerrilla movement. You are dealing with a politically fundamentalist and maximalist movement, which had been described already in scholarly literature, not propaganda, but in scholarly literature, such as the book The New Terrorism by Emeritus Professor Walter Lanka, who was at the time the head of Georgetown CSIS. He described the Tigers, he said, in terms of their ruthlessness and fanaticism, the only parallels I can see with the liberation tigers of Tamil are the European fascist movements of the 1920s and 1930s. Now, Walter Lanka was also the editor of the Penguin Pelican Reader's Guide on Fascism. Now, all of that literature was available to the Norwegians. The one name I never see in this book, and it's on Mark's part, is that the Norwegians do not seem to have talked to the man who President Pathioksoy quite rightly defined as the person who has spent the most time face to face with Jayatilleka Prabhakaran. Obviously, she went outside of the Tigers. And that was Hardeep Puri of the Indian High Commission. Now, Hardeep was the guy who shuffled back and forth talking to Jayatilleka Prabhakaran during the run-up to the Indo-Lanka Accord and the IPK and so on. But nobody bothered to talk to him. I mean, Hardeep Puri wound up India's PR to the UN, New York, and on the Security Council, when India has a Security Council, simply the largest number of votes, beating Japan, by the way. But nobody bothered to talk to him. Why? This was an entirely West-centric perspective. The Indians were kept in the loop, but nobody asked them. The most sensible voices I read in this book are the voices of the Indians. N. Ram, Nirupama Subramanian, Narayan Swamy, and the former Indian foreign secretaries, Man Singh, and so on. These guys knew, these guys and girls, knew what they were talking about. Nobody really listened. And that is why you did not have a realist position which would have worked on the basis of containing the LTT, knowing the nature of the LTT. Their behavior was predictable. They've done it many, many times before. And no other movement had done what the Tigers had done vis-a-vis, for instance, the Indian peacekeeping force. I mean, can you imagine? The Russian peacekeepers went in and supported their co-ethnics in many parts of Europe, very controversially. Could you imagine any one of those insurgent movements derived from the Russian-speaking populace turning their guns on the Russian peacekeepers and being supported by a significant segment of their own people? No. But that tells you the degree, the specificity of the Tigers and the degree of intransigence. So, the model did not correspond to the problem they were dealing with. If they had been the right model, it would have been not only based on containment and deterrence, but it would have also had a plan B. And the plan B should have been that if war was to have broken out, there would be sufficient support to the Sri Lankan state, but a support linked to the implementation of a political package. Now this was perfectly possible, even under the Rajapaksa. I see many references to Sudan and Zimbabwe and so on. That's not what the Rajapaksas are doing, whether they're conscious or not. The closest we come to what turned out to be the Rajapaksa approach was what Vladimir Putin had done in Chechnya. But even in Chechnya, Putin had an election before the final occurred. So he had an autonomy component. A realist position would have built that in to a scenario of war. We've seen it happen in Colombia, where the United States supported the Colombian state against FARC, but made that support contingent on cleaning up the Human Rights Act. That is why there are members of the Colombian military in jail. It was linked to US support, especially in terms of helicopter gunships and so on. This could have been done. It wasn't done. So, those were the failures of the model, which led to and made inevitable by default the outcome that we had. Now, to conclude, in the 3 minutes I think I have left, what we have today is a continuation or the resumption of the same liberal conflict resolution model, which failed. And this is a chronicle of that utter failure. The assumption is almost absurd that post-war you can move back to a pre-war model. Because what is being tested here is on a continuum with the political package, CFA, PTOMS, paradigm, and the two personalities, Ranil and Chandra, is predicated on that. So, okay, the war is over, the tigers are gone, Mahinda Rajapaksa has lost the election. So what do? We pick up from where we left off so disastrously. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. The book has repeated references to Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's belief in asymmetric federalism. President Kumaratunga's belief in federalism. Anton Balasingham's belief in self-determination and federalism, which is what Mr. Sambandhan has reiterated in this morning's newspapers. So the assumption seems to be, okay, the war is over, it was a pity it happened, the bad guys won, but they're no longer in office. So we'll just pick up on the bits that remain of the paradigm we tried and which blew up in our faces. And that's federalism. Now, this is as realistic as a situation in which after the US Civil War, somebody said, okay, the North won, slavery has been abolished, but let's talk about the Confederation. Or in Russia, the left, whatever was left of the left in Eastern Europe said, okay, the Berlin Wall went down, the Soviet Union is no more, the Stalinist model was what evaporated, but let's talk about socialism. That doesn't happen. That's not the way it works. So, if we are to avoid another collapse of this sort of liberal or neoliberal peace-building paradigm and a spike in polarization, I think we have to realize that there are not just one but two types of legitimacy. Certainly in Asia and more post-colonial societies. One is democratic legitimacy. The other is historical and national legitimacy. If you want to be Gramscian, you may call one conjunctural legitimacy, which comes with every new democratically elected government. And then there's organic legitimacy. You had President Colombo with a 62% vote in the 90s. You had Ranil Wickremesinghe elected Prime Minister, but their larger effort failed, and they put them together and are going to be able to pull it off. Today's Chandrika Kumaratunga is not Chandrika Kumaratunga. Any structuralist would know that the Chandrika Kumaratunga of today, or the potential 2004 Chandrika Kumaratunga of 2016, 2017, is not Chandrika, but President Maithripala himself. It's not the personality, it's the real estate, it's the structure. It's the Prime Minister and the President. It's not Ranil and Chandrika. It's the UNP and the SLP. And the more the SLP purges itself of the Rajapaksa nationalists, the more it will have to guard itself on that flank, and the less likely it will feel able to go along with the liberal accountability federalism project. So unless a realist model is substituted for the neoliberal post-conflict model, I fear that we will have a repetition, hopefully less needed, of the tragedy that Mark has so brilliantly documented in this indispensable volume. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for providing us with another perspective and from also seeing into the future in terms of pitfalls from that perspective of what is going on and what went on before. Can I now ask Jehan to make his observation?
Well, I'm happy to be able to speak. I'm happy to be able to speak here and see the very positive side of the ceasefire and the peace process that we had. I know there's a tendency today to distance ourselves from it because we see it as a failure. But taking my mind back to that time, the ceasefire, the end of the war, seemed to be something incredible. Couldn't believe it when it happened. And it did last. It lasted 4 years. The war stopped for 4 years. The mass killings, the terror of that time of the war was put back for 4 years. And it was also something conformed in accord with the principles that we aspired for, that we yearned for, which gave primacy to life and to dialogue. It offered the possibility of a negotiated settlement. Now, I think that ceasefire agreement, supported by Norway, supported by the international community, has left its legacy, which continues even today. Today, because of that ceasefire agreement, because of the peace process that failed, there is international focus on Sri Lanka. An international focus that I believe is necessary if our country is to actually find a solution, maybe not today, but sometime in the future. Why do I say this? Because the conflict that we had and continue to have is one based on an asymmetry. An asymmetry that is marked in a democracy. The asymmetry between a permanent ethnic majority and a permanent ethnic minority. during the time of the conflict, of the war, of the terrorism, the minority was able to reach some sort of parity with the majority because of its guns. Now the guns are no longer there. Now that asymmetry can best be addressed through the international community's pressure. And so the ceasefire, the peace process has left a legacy which I believe we did. Even though that peace process failed, and I will also talk a little bit about that. Mark's book, now we came to talk about Mark's book. Mark's book, I got it only day before yesterday, very busy time, so I couldn't read it, like banned it. I also got it digitally. And they have homework to do, and I go to the market and get their food. So, Mark's book, extensive, meticulous research. He has worked very hard on this. And I met him and he said that in this book there are 550 pages. He told me he has left out 200 of them. So there was more to come. And he said that he's thinking of publishing that too. And as he said, and Dayan also said, most of the material comes from those who are directly involved. So it is actually a treasure trove. And so we should thank him for that, because there is so much material there to read about that period. But what are the lessons? I would like to focus on the lessons. And there are 30 pages of lessons learned, which he has. But there are lessons right throughout the book, but he has also a section called lessons learned. And for me, the clear lessons, one of which he mentioned, the lack of bipartisanship. And I think this came from the Norwegian inability to really grasp the divided nature of our polity. Not only divided on ethnic lines, but divided on political lines, which continues today. It's still a polity that is divided on ethnic lines and divided politically. And so we have to keep that in mind. And I think I agree with Dayan on the dangers of the present situation. However, there is a difference this time, I hope. And that is, we don't have a situation where the government has a one-year deadline. That government had a one-year deadline because the president had the power after 1 year. A president from another party, a rival party that opposed the government politically, had a 1 year period in which after 1 year, she got the power to dissolve parliament. She got that power. And my belief is that the ISGA provided an excuse, a reason to dissolve, a political reason to dissolve. Second, today we have bipartisanship at the highest levels. The president is a president who came to power, won the election on the vote of the other side of the UN. And he is aware of that. Now, the question is, how long will that last? And I hope it will last. So far, it seems that it will last. But of course, there is not that bipartisanship at the grassroots level. And that's where the danger lies. At the level of the grassroots, the voters, that bipartisanship doesn't exist. So anyway, one mistake the Norwegians made, that process made, was not giving adequate attention to of seeing the fragility of the peace process due to the lack of bipartisanship. The second observation actually comes from what Mr. Akashi said at the back of the book. Akashi is the Japanese peace envoy. He said, peacemakers can only do so much. The Norwegians could only do so much. It's a thankless engagement, he said. Political circumstances are often beyond the control of the peacemakers. So that's the second lesson I think we have learned. As peacemakers, we have to also be humble because situations are bigger than us. The third, I think, I discussed it with Mark a little bit, the lack of awareness of the LTTE about the reality of international politics and the support that they enjoy. I have spoken to persons involved in that peace process who were very bitter and disappointed how the LTT misread the situation right at the end. That meant they misread it even before. Right at the end, when there were offers to try and ensure that there would be a structured surrender, the LTT turned those offers down. And those who talked to me said that they blamed the diaspora for that, because the diaspora knew better, or should have known better. The LTT was not like the IRA. IRA was of a certain intellectual caliber. They were networked with the world on equal terms, but not the LTT. I also remember one of my colleagues in the peace civil society who took a group of LTT to Switzerland, and on his return he said that the LTT were very disappointed by what they saw in Switzerland, because they went to a confederate state. So they thought that this is the model that they might like to follow. But they were very disappointed when they saw the power of the central government in Switzerland. So that meant that that much more work had to be done to take the LTT to a different level of understanding. The fourth lesson, I think, would be that there was a lack of a political framework which encompassed the ceasefire. The Norwegians, the ceasefire was like in a vacuum. No direction. Where are we going? To peace, but on what terms? The Norwegians attempted to set the parameters. They said, we are facilitating this peace process in terms of the unity of Sri Lanka, where Tamil aspirations will be met. But that was not accepted by the party, like the LTT didn't accept, it was not there in the ceasefire agreement. Now, the Myanmar ceasefire, there's a national ceasefire agreement signed in Myanmar between the government of Myanmar and 16 armed ethnic groups. And in that ceasefire agreement, it is a preface, the preamble that states that those who sign they will accept the, I don't remember exactly the word, but basically the undivided nature of the Myanmar state. And there are three sort of sentences on that, on the undivided, and the sovereignty of Myanmar, the undivided nature of the sovereignty of Myanmar. But in turn, the Myanmar government says, we accept that the solution will be on federal lines, as was agreed in 1947. So the parameters have been set there. The parties know what they are getting into. Now, in a way, I listened to Dayan and the sense that it was actually not possible to negotiate in the neoliberal way with the LTT. But then the thought came to me, see, even in this flawed negotiation, we saw the LTT split. Karuna broke away. Supposing the negotiations had been conducted properly, with all the defects taken out of it, but on the neoliberal, textbook way. Maybe he wouldn't remain Prabhakaran, although he ordered assassination of this person and that person, and therefore difficult for him to surface, and other than in an entity which he controlled totally. Maybe if he didn't change, he would be changed. After all, that happened in Sri Lanka too, at the 2015 election. What we thought was not possible, what we thought was impossible. A government that had a winning formula of nationalism to get the 75% to vote for them, that had a winning formula of national security threats, which meant a big army behind it. That government lost because why? There was an internal split in that government. So the impossible can happen. It might have happened with the LTP, and if that process had been allowed to go forward, it would have been spared all what we are going through now. So, and then also Dayan's realist perspective, I think actually, when the war broke out, the ones who should have followed it should have been the Rajapaksa government. They didn't. You said how in Colombia, with human rights conditionalities, autonomy, the way every Chandrika tried to fight the war. Too strong, and may not be. But anyway, the Rajapaksa, the realist perspective is actually applicable to the way Rajapaksa followed when the ceasefire broke down. Anyway, but I think today some of the lessons we have learned. One of the lessons is that there will be bipartisanship. There is bipartisanship at the present time. There is focus on a constitutional settlement that will lock the system in place rather than have a struggle at the ground level where there is no agreement on the parameters. So there is a bid on the part of the government to engage in constitutional change, which will give permanency to the good intentions of the parties. And also the recognition that the pace of change is not the same for all. Some sections of our population will change faster than others. So we need to have, I think, constant dialogue. What is needed is constant dialogue between all sections of the population. Maybe it's not happening the way it should, and that is the challenge for civil society and for the policy.
Thanks, Jehan. Thanks for that perspective as well, drawing out some lessons there. And also, again, warning about repetition, but also the more optimistic side of what happened, what the legacy might be. We now, I think, have about half an hour for questions to the panel from the audience. Please make your questions as short as possible, as concise as possible, and identify yourselves when you are when you are asking your question. Who would like to kick off? Sorry. Could you please identify yourself?
I am from Academic Study Circle. It's Dr. Jayatilleka's explanation. He mentioned that the President Mahinda Rajapaksa at the conclusion of the war, had he been able to make a political solution, that would have been something else, the positive thing. Do you now the last government, the Bangladesh government, assured that as a political solution, they will implement the 13th Amendment fully, and the international community and the United States. If any other party or they ask or pursue for such course of political solution, do you endorse that such implementing 13th Amendment? And the other thing is, in alternative for a 13th Amendment or any other political solution, giving more devolution power to ethnic-based, Tamil-speaking people, if there is any alternative arrangement where the Tamil-speaking people will have participatory democracy in the central government, where to some extent this government also tells, but it's not clear what would be. If we advocate, or isn't there a possibility, the Tamil people, TNA, will say whatever party or minorities, to get into in the central government, into central parliament, some modality where they will get the opportunity and the power in the parliament, like not exactly like the this state council, the executive committee system, something like that, where this government also does it spells out. That could mean that not be helpful. Thank you.
I had advocated throughout the war and at the end of the war the implementation of the 13th Amendment, which is one of the reasons I believe I lost my job 6 weeks after we won the Battle of the Resolution in Geneva. So I advocate a realist perspective even then. Unfortunately, the balancing forces in the administration of the day was such that the neoconservative perspective had prevailed. President Rajapaksa himself, in signing the joint statement with the government of India and with Ban Ki-moon after the victory, showed that he was not opposed to the realist view, which is why those two statements have the reference to the implementation of the 13th Amendment. But the actual balance of forces, at the time, General Saravanamuttu represented the military. Later, I believe the Secretary of Defense, the President's own brother, tilted the balance in favor of the neoconservative view. But this happens in other parts of the world. It's never a good thing. You have sometimes wars which are quite justifiable in terms of self-defense, such as the Six-Day War, the Israeli Six-Day War. But in the aftermath, the political settlement, the political outcome, remains unresolved or moves in a wrong direction. It's very rarely that you find the right political solution following following a war. It's a different struggle. So I'm for the implementation of the 13th Amendment now. I do not envisage any possibility of a political settlement without a genuine measure of devolution and provincial autonomy. I do not believe in a trade-off with participation at the center, because it tends to be a cop-out. It's really a code word for assimilation, and I don't think that our people are going to accept it. And in any case, if you have a constitutional arrangement in which one religion or one language has a preeminence of place, which I believe will be the case given the specificity of the island, then you cannot have a solution that is based on full integration, because you do not have full equality of citizenship when one marker of identity is privileged over the other. Now, that is the reality. That being the case, then you have to have a real measure of devolution at the periphery. However, any attempt to sneak in federalism by any other name will lead to disaster. And Jehan's optimism about bipartisanship begs the question. You can still have a bipartisan consensus and you can refrain from dissolving the legislature you can certainly have a recomposition and a reshuffle.
I'm Shamini Perera from the Dayan newspaper. I would like to ask you, did the Norwegian government make an attempt to save Mr. Ranil's? Because in 2005, November, you alleged his book, 8th chapter, that there had been an alleged deal with the former leader, Rajapaksa, and that to prevent Tamil-speaking people from exercising their franchise. I would like to ask you, the Norwegians heard about this situation in September 2005. The former president, Colombo, informed Norway, and the civil society organizations informed all knew what was happening. But Norway allowed the LTT to stop people from voting for Mr. Pathioksoy, and thereby help Rajapaksa to come to power. Now my issue is that announcement was made by Mr. R. Samman, the present opposition leader. But I see in your book, Mark, you have not mentioned that fact. Now you said that you spoke to so many people. Did you speak to someone? Did you ask the PNA whether it was aware of an alleged dispute between Perera and Mr. Rajapaksa?
Well, thanks for the question, Shirley, that we've been corresponding about this division. I'll try to be brief. Okay, what I report in the book is allegations that were voiced by numbers of people that I interviewed that the outcome of the 2005 presidential elections, which Mahinda Rajapaksa won very narrowly, was the result of what we also know a Tamil boycott of the vote in the Northeast. But the allegation behind that is that the Tamil boycott, the LTT call for a boycott, was the result of a deal made between Mahinda Rajapaksa's circle, if you like, because he was only Prime Minister still at this point, and the LTT, and that it involved substantial amounts of money, and it's an allegation that has surfaced ever since in different media, for example. So actually my main point in the book was simply to report this allegation that I heard. I will confess though, I find it a particularly interesting allegation because, number one, it's not really being aired properly in public yet, although if Lankan, the former LTT financier, appears in court, as I understand it's supposed to be doing in the near future, that situation will change. But also because, of course, if it is true, then it really gives cause to think again, quite seriously. It throws the Rajapaksa victory in that election into somewhat new light, and it also perhaps raises some questions of ethics and morality, at least in my view. So that's why it's in there. Quite frankly, I didn't, the Norwegians were in no position on this issue, as with many others, to kind of make an active intervention. They were facilitating the peace process. The SLMM were the people on the ground, and their job was to monitor violations of the ceasefire. Okay? And if I can just add here, one point, because it slightly jumps to something I wanted to say in response to Dayan's presentation earlier. I do thank you for his kind words about the book. I'm very impressed that he read it in 48 hours. That's got to be some kind of record. I'll mention that many times. See if anybody can beat you on that. No, I think the broader point which illustrates is this. I think there is an understandable but problematic tendency for people looking back at the war to ascribe to the Norwegians almost kind of divine powers of potential intervention. They could have done this, they could have done that. Let's be very clear, and this is also to you, Dayan. The Norwegians came into the facilitation role in this country on a very specific, defined mandate. It's what Lakshman Government described as a lightweight facilitator. That's what the government of Sri Lanka wanted. They were not in a position to impose any kind of model, any kind of peace movement, whether it's neoliberal, neoconservative, or any other ism. What their job was to do was to, their mandate was to facilitate negotiation. That's what they tried to do. Now, when I gave you those lessons learned, my final lessons learned point, of like points, strategic points where things went wrong, and they perhaps didn't need to, I say that advisedly, because in my view, the failure of the peace process needs to be understood as a series of avoidable tragedies. It didn't have to go that way. It wasn't inevitable. There was no inevitability about the descent into war. If the peace process had been pursued more thoughtfully, those things might have been avoided. My only point is, don't, if you agree with that analysis, ascribe all the failings to the Norwegians, which honestly, Dayan, you still continue to do. You talk about the Norwegians' model and how they failed with their model. They didn't have a model. That was not what they were asked to do. There may have been models in other people's heads, like your own, but I don't think they were there in the heads of the facilitators. So, back to your question, Sharindra. Good question. I hope others will follow up with this.
I just want to ask you one moment. Will the owner of vehicle 7348 please speak to Mr. Thamiraja outside the vehicle, seems to be blocking others. Vehicle number 7348. Thank you.
I just want to ask you one more, please. I just want to ask you, did you speak with anyone from the TAU? No.
I tried, but it was not possible at the point at which I was in this country at that time.
Let Dan make his response number. Let Dan make his response number.
Mark, if I may correct the impression in my dad. I'm not, as I said, I'm not blaming the Norwegians, because the Norwegians were not the only ones who failed. What is crucial is the simple logic. If there are successive attempts which fail at the hands of different states or regimes, all of those are variables. The Indians tried, they failed. Premadasa tried, he failed. Chandrika tried, she failed. The Norwegians tried, they failed. Then logic tells us that you have to look not at the variable, the thing that keeps changing, the nature of the regime that engages in the peace process, but at the constant, which is the tigers. That's my point. And by the time the Norwegians came in, the Indians had failed, Premadasa had failed, and CVK had failed. And that was something their perspective should have fastened on, but it didn't. So it's not, that was the point of making. Shamendra, I would think that, though this is a big sort of news thing, I really think it's a non-issue, because the Tigers tilted to Ranil during the presidential election of 1999, and they tilted against him and in favor of Rajapaksa, and so the allegation goes, in 2005. On both occasions, Mr. Wickremesinghe lost. He lost when the Tigers tilted in his favor, he lost when the Tigers tilted against him. Now what does that show? That on both occasions, he had predicated his electoral strategy on a variable that he had very little control over. Mahinda Rajapaksa, now the Tigers didn't say, stop the ballot for Mahinda. They said, don't go and vote. Why did that affect Ranil more than it affected Mahinda? Because Mahinda had not based himself on the northern vote. He based himself on the southern vote. And the second point is, maybe they gave the money, but then so did the Indians. There must be several people in this room who remember the huge, I think 50 crores, I can't remember, the huge amount that was given to the Tigers by the government of India at the time of the Indo-Lanka Accord. The story broke in the Indian newspapers. It was written by a young journalist called Junaid Bhagat. A huge amount of money. That everybody gave the Tigers money at some point or the other, because the Tigers kept saying, what about our cadre? We have to take care of the existential needs of our people. So they were given huge amounts of money. The point is not that. The point is, you give them money, they take the money, they go back to war at some point, and then what does the government of the day, which may be the one that gave them the money in the first place, do? Mahinda Rajapaksa may or may not have given them the money, but when they went back to war, he did take them out. And that's what matters. The others didn't.
Now,
No, it was just that basically we had so big of discussions. They had just one agenda, that was Prabhakaran had wanted a separate state, and there was no compromise, no question at all. And with regard to your monitoring committee, there were 218 violations of the ceasefire agreement by the LTT, and the monitoring committee looked aside.
Well, just very quickly, look, you're talking about the SLMM, this one mission. The numbers of allegations, the violations, were enormous, but it's important to distinguish between quantitative and qualitative violations. One of the failings with the SLM's mandate, which was recognised, I think, by most proposals of it, is that it didn't allow them to distinguish. So the LTT hoisting the flag was a violation in the same sense that pulling in shipments of weapons from off-trade committee was also a violation. Now, that's clearly an inappropriate perspective. So just to make that
Not such simple violations. We had that documented in Peace Secretariat, the serious violations of peace agreement.
anyone else with a question? No. Amazing. Without the quiet, reflective thought.
Maybe a comment.
Yes, Mike.
Linked to this, not so much a question, but a comment. I think that I was a witness at the time. I was in the UN, and I remember at the meetings we had, we were discussing the principle of universality of human rights, and the fact that tigers would, seemingly taking advantage of the ceasefire agreement. For example, in Pathioksoy, they would go to government control areas because they were allowed to move into government control areas, and we had families who had gone to government control areas for protection. And at night, the Thais would come and say, you thought you could escape from us, but actually we want your kids to come and join us, etc. And when we were discussing these really tricky things, we were basically told, well, don't rock the peace boat. When we try to achieve something perfect, you cannot. So it was quite problematic to us, because for the sake of the peace process, do you put some right issues into the draw, so that was really problematic. So that's a point you may want to react on that. My second point is in relation to the diaspora. I happen to be involved in the preparation of Tokyo in the Tokyo meeting that you were mentioning, and it was quite interesting. We could really see how isolated the LTT were, because they didn't have anybody to come and discuss about education, health, etc. So they got people from Australia, etc. They asked help for that, and various countries also helped for this to happen. But the problem is that some of these people who came, some eminent people, professors, etc., academics, the problem is that these people had a sense of guilt, because they were not here, they were not in the valley, right? They were outside, happily enjoying life there. So when they came, they became more LTT than the LTT. And so it was 2 points there. One is the way how the LTT was isolated, and how I think Jehan had really a point that the diaspora, instead of having a constant dialogue with the LTT and making them understand the reality of the world, when they came into the scene, they came with a very strong sense of guilt that didn't really sort out anything actually complicated matters.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That was very helpful. I sort of agree with you on both your points. The human rights dimension, the problematic of human rights issues during the ceasefire, and also the role of the diaspora. Perhaps just take the diaspora first. I think it's a generalizable sort of proposition that look around conflicts in the world, former Yugoslavia, classic country. Diaspora is fundamentally unhelpful, often taking a more radical political stance than the relevant group within the country, funding all the wrong things, pushing all the wrong solutions and doing it for motivations that may not be particularly linked to the realities of the country today. That said, they are an unavoidable part of the equation. It's why I think that the current government commendably have really made an effort to engage in dialogue with the Tamil diaspora in the West, because they recognise, I think, that like them or hate them, they're part of the equation. So let's try and get them inside the tent rather than outside. I'll read the other phrase. So I agree with you entirely about that. I think the broader point about the isolation of the LTT, I mean, one of the really strong things that Eric Solheim continues to say, and if he'd been here today, I'm sure he would have said it, was about the isolation of Perera during the time that the Norwegians were involved, is that, you know, the Norwegians were advocating very strongly to the government for more contact, for more internationals to come and visit Perera and to kind of expose him just to the different things of the world out there. Remember, we're talking about a man who maybe never ever even spoken to a Sinhalese person in his life, who certainly hadn't been outside the valley since he was in India in the 80s. Not a man with a particularly informed perspective, a perspective informed by understanding or experience of the rest of the world. So the Norwegians will tell you is that whereas they pushed for, you know, increased international contacts with Perera, but by and large, the way the government played it was that meetings with Perera, even for the Norwegians, were a kind of reward for good behaviour by Perera, and that just wasn't appropriate. You know, in the end, it was only Chris Patten, the former British government minister and EU foreign affairs chief, who I think he was, in fact, probably the only other, you know, international bar the Norwich who met Perera during the entire ceasefire period and beyond. So that, I think, I may have missed someone, but Akashi, possibly, that's true, actually. But, you know, this isolation was really a very profound feature, and just to conclude on this, something that Eric also points out is that, you know, Balasingham's importance in this. He was the man, the person that the Norwegians could actually have conversations about the issues which were informed by a broader international perspective. It was always agreed, by no means, but at least they were talking more or less on the same level. And that following Balasingham's death in 2006, not a single political proposal of any substance ever again emerged from the LTT. I think that tells you something about the isolation. Even though there were still people like Tom Sherman who had been part of the LTT delegations to the peace talks, there just was not that kind of, there was no foreign service, there was no, you know, there was just a few individuals who had some experience of the outside world. Now that, of course, does make it doubly difficult to kind of deal with. Final thing I want to say here, because it's something that was just touched on just now, but you mentioned it, Dayan. It's about the Indians. Now, about the Indians. Now, I can't give you chapter and verse of this, but I'm pretty certain that the Norwegians, in the course of those years, talked to everybody and anybody you can think of in the Indian side of things. I mean, you can check it, I'm curious, but I'm pretty certain that they would have talked to them. They would have used to say to me during meetings, listen, we understood from the beginning of the peace process, the first thing we did after leaving Colombo was to head for New Delhi for debriefings, consultations with the Indians. They developed a very, very strong working relationship with the Indians, and I find it hard to believe that that relationship was not also containing learnings from Indian experience in the IPPF efforts in Sri Lanka. I think maybe, just quite honestly, on occasions they listened and respectfully differed in their analysis of what was required now in 2003, not what it looked like in 1987 in the Jayatilleka. So I think there was a strong, feisty dialogue that continued, an exchange of information and understanding. So I really would like to think that whatever the Norwegians did here was at least informed by an understanding of the Indian experience.
I have to tell you my own experience about the Indian involvement, because I was the third person there when High Commissioner Nirupam Sen, still alive, very much alive, told Lakshman Kaka, Lakshman, we warned you about the Norwegians. Now, this isn't just me telling tales out of school. Remember that India removed High Commissioner Gopal Krishna Gandhi in the middle of this term when Ranil Wickremesinghe was made PM and the CFA when he hooked up with the Norwegians. And they removed Gopal Krishna Gandhi because he was seen to be too dovish, and they brought in Nirupam Sen, who was the ambassador in Norway and who had somewhat more realist views, and he worked very closely with Lakshman Kaka on what happened in terms of the election of 2004 and so on. So I wouldn't be quite so sure that India was not apprehensive. I think there's a line in your book where one of the Indians, maybe Enram, I'm not sure, one of the Indians quoted as saying that India thought that the CFA gave too much leeway to the LTT. It's in your book. So I think that, yes, Norway kept India in the loop, but they weren't necessarily on the same page when it came to the titles and the CFA and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's perceived concessions of his, which is why India did support the regime change of 2004 because it felt threatened, particularly in terms of the maritime situation. So I'm not convinced about that one. Now about the diaspora, I think we have to face some unpalatable truths very squarely. It was said that unlike the IRA, when the LTT delegation went to Switzerland, they were kind of dismayed by the strength of the central government. The IRA was more sophisticated. Now, the Irish diaspora was never as well placed as the Tamil diaspora in terms of education, the professional profile. The Irish were not. The Tamil diaspora was and is. So there is an unacknowledged paradox, if you want to be polite, between the educational profile of the Tamil diaspora and the acceptance by most of the political leadership of Jayatilleka, whom you describe, as this isolated, somewhat, bit of a roughneck. This is not just a question of a huckleberry finn from Directore, and poor guy, he got the benefit of education, so he became sort of beastly sort of fellow. The Tamil diaspora went along with the guy, not only went along with him, when he murdered other much better educated Tamils, such as Rajanindranagama, such as Neelan Tiruchol, just a few yards down the road, such as Kedish Loganathan, and cleaned out other movements which were led by far better educated Tamils. I mean, he didn't get Maheshwaran killed, but the plot was wiped out. Maheshwaran was a survey. There was no split in the diaspora, and that couldn't be terror because these were people who were living in Western societies. You could have had a social democratic option. I mean, the diaspora did not take the coloration of the political pluralism, the pluralistic political cultures of the countries in which they were. There were no communists, there were no social democrats, there were no liberal democrats. They went along with the LTT, despite the profile of Jayatilleka. Why? My hypothesis is that as this process of elimination, including the massacre of the Tello, the massacre of the EPRLF, as all this was taking place, the killing of Neelan, all of this, somehow, Jayatilleka Prabhakaran and the movement that he founded was seen as a reflection, as more accurate a reflection of the self-image, at least of the Tamil diaspora, and possibly even a large section of the Tamil community of the state.
Yes, sir.
just remind that the first time that we met in Oslo, Peace Secretariat, Balasingham agreed to explore a federal solution within a united Sri Lanka. And Balasingham may be dead, but his wife is still alive, and she will say what happened when they reported to Prabhakaran. He was lucky to have got away. If not for his wife, Prabhakaran would have killed Balasingham.
Anyone else? Yes, gentleman right to the back.
Dr. Jayatilleka, in the light of what you just said about the diaspora and a large section of perhaps domestically resident Tamil people sharing elements, unsavory elements of Prabhakaran's personality, do you think that now that personality has been eliminated, that those residual archives still remains? And in that sense, you described the LTT as being an irredeemably intransigent organization which you were incapable of engaging with. In that light, if those personality traits do remain, do you think that there is an engagement possible going forward?
Well, that's an open question, but it remains a question. I don't think that one should be negative. But this is something I've always asked Mrs. Sambandhan, for instance, who is very moderate. I respect him, even when I was serving in Geneva, whenever he passed through, I always posted him. But I've asked him this question, which is, why is it that what is acceptable to the Catholic minority of Northern Ireland is not acceptable to the Tamil minority or the Tamil people of Northern Sri Lanka? Now the Catholics do have a long narrative. It goes back, if you listen to their songs, to the potato famine of a couple of centuries ago. I mean, they've got all their heroes, they've got their murals, they've got their romantic ballads, but they didn't insist on converting Britain to a republic. They're Republicans. They accepted and even shook hands with the Queen. They did not insist, there's nothing about accountability in the Good Friday Agreement. And they agreed to a political solution of devolution within a nominally unitary Britain. They didn't even ask for conversion to federalism. They made a political outreach to the Paisleyite Protestants, which is why the power sharing worked. Now, why is it that the moderate DNA keeps saying two things which the IRA, the Sinn Féin IRA never did? One is about accountability, where the most moderate of the DNA members, Mr. Sumandaran, and most recently in quoted an article in Ground Views, said that if there aren't foreign participants, and if there isn't, and he says there may be a tendency not to go too deep into the bones. And if you don't go too deep into the bones, then amputation may become necessary. Now, he's talking about the kind of accountability that the IRA never asked for. They didn't ask for accountability about what happened in Gibraltar. They didn't ask for accountability for Bloody Sunday. They didn't ask for accountability for Bobby Sands. Why he couldn't have been treated as a political prisoner. Why? Because they didn't care? No. Because they wanted the agreement to work. They didn't ask for a federal system. They settled for devolution within what still remains on paper a unitary British state. The UK describes itself as a unitary state. Now, why is it that even the most moderate Tamil formation goes beyond what ex-urban guerrillas of the Sinn Féin stop short of asking for? If that remains the case, and we shall see going into this constitutional process, then I am pessimistic. Because contrary to what Jehan said, I am struck by the fact that it has taken 3 months, from January 9th to the 9th of March, 2 months, to even agree on the procedural roadmap for constitutional change. And the term new has been dropped. I'm happy about it. The idea of a new constitution has been dropped. in favor of obviously constitutional renovation or reform. Though there will be attempts to make it a new constitution under the guise of constitutional reform. But there was a deadlock for 2 months between the UNP and the SLFP, not the joint. So, it will all depend on whether the TNA persists in pushing for more than the traffic can bear. And that, if I may connect up with the original point, that would reflect an ideology, consciousness and self-image of Tamil nationalism. That is what I would call Tamil exceptionalism. Because no other community would have supported the Tigers in going against the IPKF and the Indo-Lanka Accord. No other community, not in Crimea, not in Ossetia. It doesn't happen. If your co-ethnics come over and carve out something for you, an enclave, and have a peacekeeping force to the tripwire, you're very happy, that's it. But here they weren't. So there is a kind of a self-image that we can be a Tamil Israel in South Asia. If that goes on, and that is what made them go along with Prabhakaran. Because Prabhakaran measured up to their self-image. The LTE, the machine, and in that arrogant ruthlessness, that was the sense of superiority. Now, if that remains, despite Nandikata, well, then you will have a political equivalent. It won't work. And no elected Sri Lankan politician from the president onwards is going to put his neck on the electoral chopper to serve accountability with foreign participation and de facto federalism to the electorate. It never happened, it won't happen.
Is that exceptionalism congenital or is it a reaction to authoritarianism?
Well, Lord Salisbury had to tell the Tamil representatives that you can't turn a majority into a minority and a minority into a majority, and that will be co-majoritarianism.
Well, there are lots of self-perceptions and perceptions of communities that we can many about, and which no doubt will be part of the public discourse as we move into constitutional reform in the coming months. Presumably, if there are no other questions or comments, it is left to me to bring this meeting to a close and to thank all the speakers for their rich contributions in terms of highlighting lessons learned, trapped minefields into the future, new perspectives, updating what has happened before in terms of what is happening now and what might be. I think these are conversations that we are going to continue to have for at least the next 6 to 7 months. And thank you, Mark, for the book, which, apart from what it does in terms of inspiring the conversations we're going to have in the country at large, is, as all the speakers have said, and then we reiterate this, is indeed a very, very important and valuable contribution both to the research as well as advocacy and public policy in this country, because it is a rich primary source of information.
Thanks. I'm only going to just say one thing to end from my side, because it's just practical information, but it kind of keeps up as you can see, the ongoing dialogue with Dayan. I really had to hold myself in on this last bit. That's all right, we'll carry on with the drinks after. No, just to say, apropos hearing it from the horse's mouth in India, may interest you, some of you to know that next stop, Chennai, we have a launch in Chennai on Tuesday, at which both Mr. N. Ram of the Hindu and Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi will be present, inshallah, all being well. And then on Wednesday, and when I say we, I'm saying Eric Sulheim and myself, will proceed to Delhi, where we'll hear it truly from the horse's mouth, and I will make a point of checking with Mr. Lankan Singh. Precise. Yeah, but Lankan Singh is chairing the the precise errors and inaccuracies of your presentation of the Indian position. Although that's probably not true. Thank you very much for everybody.
Right, thank you. I just want to